Those of you that I haven't had the opportunity to meet as yet, my name is Jill Stewart. I'm the CEO of the IAB in New Zealand. Thank you for joining us everyone this morning for the IAB Tech Lab Project Rearc webinar. This is an exclusive briefing from Jordan Mitchell, followed by a Q&A session hosted by Dan Richardson. Dan Richard is on the IAB New Zealand Standards and Measurement Council. Jordan is the Senior Vice President for Identity, Data and Privacy for the IAB Tech Lab. The Tech Lab is a global member community which is creating and developing foundational technology and standards that enable growth and trust in the digital media ecosystem. Project Rearc is a global call to action for stakeholders across the digital supply chain to rethink and to re-architect digital marketing to support core industry use cases whilst balancing consumer privacy and personalisation. Through it, the global IABs and the global tech standards body, the IAB Tech Lab, have begun to review and to develop approaches to support the industry and manage consumer privacy, safety, identity and other needs in the post-cookie digital marketing supply chain. The work is and needs to be a collaborative effort across the entire industry, marketers, agencies, publishers, etc. This morning, Jordan will be addressing the end of third-party cookies, why they're going away, what's the impact, and more importantly, what we do now. How do we build a better future and not fall into the same areas that may be challenging us all today? The IAB Tech Lab team have focused directly on building solutions that help enable our industry to operate in different regulatory environments. Many of you will be aware that there are important changes to the Privacy Act in New Zealand, which come into effect on the 1st of December. However, the solutions will be agile enough to suit global needs. Jordan's address will also speak to the Privacy Sandbox, which is a collection of proposals or draft specifications that endeavour to enable addressability use cases without any tracking capabilities, so via identifiers, cookies, fingerprinting, etc. Following Jordan's presentation, Dan Richardson, Head of Data for Australia and New Zealand for Verizon Media, on behalf of the IAB New Zealand Standards and Measurement Council, will be hosting a Q&A session. So please feel free to send your questions in during Jordan's presentation. And lastly, thanks to Dan, Tom Braybook, Rachel Bayfield, Chair and Vice Chair of the Standards and Measurement Council, and also Brian Ing of the Standards and Measurement Council also for arranging this morning's webinar. So thank you, Jordan, and over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm not on mute anymore. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm speaking to you from lovely Seattle, Washington in the US, where it is 4 p.m. Yesterday for you, and it's a lovely summer day outside. I think Jill teed up quite well what I'll be talking about. I'm going to start with some of the key takeaways, and then I'm going to echo them at the end. There is a lot of content here that I'll move through quickly, but the key takeaways are pretty clear. Our systems today that power digital advertising, whether you're a publisher or an advertiser, depend on cookies, device IDs, or some sort of identity to support the addressability use cases. And those are all being removed, and we all have to work together to fix that and re-architect those systems for privacy preserving addressability with technical standards and guidelines and accountability programs, which is incredibly important because we won't have addressability unless we have some accountability that we can demonstrate to the right folks who will challenge anything that we do. I would also stress that now is not the time for continued fragmented, proprietary, opaque tracking techniques while they pull out some of these identifiers. That is not going to work in our favor. We must all work together instead on baseline standards that move the bar for the whole industry forward and establishes long-term feasibility for these approaches. And with that, what I'll do is I'll talk just a little bit about Tech Lab. Jill teed it up a little bit. We really engage a strong, mostly a technology community to develop tech standards for the industry globally. This is done in a way where we come together and share the costs and share the benefits with an open source nonprofit environment where there's no bias towards any one company or category. And the thing about standards is it has to be broad availability and utility by design, with a good bar for innovation to happen above that. We're fortunate to have over 750 companies involved with Tech Lab globally, more than 20 working groups, and nearly 3,000 now distinct individuals who assist us in this over 40 different countries. If you don't know what we mean by tech standards, it's pretty easy to think of. We rely on them every day: Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, USB. These are all standards that we use as consumers every single day, probably right now, in fact. And what they've done is those hardware companies have come together to say, let's do all this the same way so that consumers can connect and then we can innovate on top of that. And Tech Lab standards are similar, but for digital media. And it really helps increase the efficiency of product development and reduce the engineering costs for innovation in our industry and mitigate a lot of the risks and really fueling the growth of an industry. And we work with the majority of the IAB organizations globally. The regional and national IABs exist to support sales and marketing functions in those local areas, and that's incredibly important in supporting proprietary innovation with all the companies that are our members. Tech Lab focuses on supporting product development. So the two really marry quite well. We focus on the technical folks who write the software, and we provide them with standardized protocols and specs. And then our IAB partners support the go-to-market efforts with education, certification, research, and you know the value that they all provide. Our focus area is our portfolio standards. Some of these, this is a bit of an exhaustive chart, but I'll focus on just the 4 top columns where we focus on identity, data, and privacy, and that's the area I head up for Tech Lab. Also brand safety and ad fraud, ad experiences and measurement, and of course programmatic effectiveness. 4 very key areas for our industry to move forward, and a lot of different things that we work with, that we bring together into a cohesive framework, from RTB to ads.txt to Open Direct to data label and the content and audience taxonomies, etc. And our priorities this year, these are our priorities in order based on our board and our member feedback. Really with privacy, preserving addressability at the forefront of this, and technical solutions to support privacy second, along with supply chain transparency. And then measurement and attribution really fits along well with number 1 through 3. So this is right square in our sweet spot of priorities. And now I'll get into the subject matter. So identifiers are used by all of our software systems today to support all addressability use cases and all the systems that support those use cases. From measurement and creative messaging to attribution, targeting and retargeting, even privacy, all relies on some identifier. Well, starting a couple years ago, the browser and OS platforms started deprecating, treating differently third-party cookies, which is a long-standing standard within HTTP. And they've since even focused on some of the device IDs as well. And all of these efforts, even with the Chrome announcement and the Privacy Sandbox, it is squarely focused, or it's done with the explicit focus. There may be implicit objectives as well. After all, commercial companies exist to compete and build shareholder value, and that's fine. But this is really a movement about reducing cross-site tracking at scale, cross-site, cross-app. The unparalleled collection of personal data that can happen when you have identifiers freely available to everybody at scale. And so that's being removed now, and that is going to greatly affect our industry. The software and the systems supporting our ed industry are going to need to be retooled to accommodate these vast changes over the next 18 months, putting the consumer and their privacy at the center. And so this affects a lot of the addressability use cases. This is not just monetization for publishers and targeting, one-to-one targeting and addressability for advertisers. This affects the entire digital advertising life cycle of all of their activities and the whole business model of a publisher, from user acquisition to content optimization, all the way to re-engagement with consumers. This affects a lot of the components here. So we have to recognize that it's between consumers and the brands they trust now. Some consumers don't want any tracking at all, and we have to respect that. Some want the ultimate in personalization and the conveniences afforded by that, and free access to content and services instead of paying for access to apps and content and services. Some want a combination. We all know people. We are those people who have different tolerance levels on this continuum. So Project Rearc is an effort to harmonize that for all consumers and re-architect our industry with solutions that support a number of key criteria. We want to support the open web and open accessibility for consumers to advertising-funded content and services when they want that versus paid content and services, and fuel that competitive innovation and market innovation among our companies, all centered around consumer transparency, choice, and control, while reinforcing that relationship of consumers with the brands that they trust, the publisher and the advertiser brands, while also respecting the fact that third parties are key to delivering those experiences. And interoperability is key here. That allows us, through standards, to all be doing the same thing so that we can focus on innovation. The critical components here, there isn't going to be one ring that rules them all. There isn't going to be one identifier, in our opinion. What we have to do is build technical standards and guidelines around the identity space where there is a lot of great innovation. And we want to set a high bar for how that gets done going forward, with accountability and compliance at the center of it, so that we can explain to regulators, to privacy advocacy groups, to our partners, and the browser OS platforms, the privacy engineers, and demystify the black box of ad technology and how these things happen. We have to demonstrate accountability, and so that's going to be a critical component here. We've spent a bit of time talking to the browser OS platforms, even as recently as I think a week and a half ago. This is a movement from years and years of tracking by default the availability of an identifier, and with it, the ability for a lot of us to be collecting a lot of data, sometimes not without the permission of the brands or the publishers that have the data, unfortunately. So this is a movement to completely go to the other side of the continuum of addressability and tracking. Privacy by default, absent any choice that a consumer makes, they are not addressable. And this is what the browser OS platforms are doing, and which will move into other channels as well. We're quite sure of it. And we will always need to we'll always have these scenarios where there is no addressability, one-to-one addressability. There is experimentation right now around Privacy Sandbox is an example of on-device data where, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit, where the decisioning and the measurement and the targeting is done on device, and it shifts the landscape quite a bit. Of course, first parties and in their relationship with consumers directly still have, and should always have, the opportunity to either develop demographics or behavioral information from those consumers, oftentimes with consent, depending on the region that you're in, with consent requirements, utilizing their CRM databases and their commerce engagement levels with consumers directly, or even utilizing some sort of authentication method, a login or provide an email, which we've seen. And those are scenarios as well that we have to support. These are all three privacy by default scenarios that are important for us to recognize and move towards as an industry. And the role of standards is to standardize how we operate together in all these scenarios, either through a content taxonomy, which Tech Lab has, that allows publishers to describe their content all in the same way and pass that through OpenRTB so as to provide scale to buyers. Within these discussions, within the on-device area, we're engaging directly with the browser OS platforms in the venue of their choice, W3C, and we're providing feedback and input on the use cases and really focusing on interoperability and cross-platform consistency. In the first-party data front, we're focusing on, again, a standardized taxonomy, this time for audience segmentation, also data labeling standards, which if you think in terms of a nutrition label for the food that you buy at your local market, this provides some of the provenance of how that audience segment was arrived at, that allows direct, engaged brands and publishers who are collecting that directly from consumers to describe their audiences in a way that is a little bit more instructive to everyone in the supply chain and provides transparency as to how did they come up with that segment. And great for the machine learning models to be able to optimize on that basis. And of course, standards for authenticated consumers, which I'll talk about in just a moment. In all of this, it's about best practices, supporting scale, ensuring accountability. And there isn't going to be one solution here. We have to address all of these different scenarios because we cannot, unfortunately, depend on iOS and Android doing things the same way, or the different browsers doing the same way, or the connected TV to be operating the same way. So we really need to make this work and establish these guidelines across all channels. On the authenticated consumer front, we're focused on enabling that privacy and accountability through a trusted supply chain. One of the issues of today is when there's an RTB request and an identifier passed in, anyone who listens in on that request that does not have that direct relationship with the consumer, or perhaps even with the publisher, is able to capture some of that behavioral data. And what we're looking to do is to allow a consumer who has a direct relationship with a brand, with an advertiser, leading advertiser, and then that same relationship with a leading publisher, a publisher that they trust, for the consumer to connect those two through, maybe they log into them, or they provide the same information and acknowledge that they want to connect those two together. And I mean, I envision a world where I can trust the advertisers and the brands that I appreciate and I want to hear more from, with the publishers that I go to every day, the news sites, and the different publishers, the interest sites, and connect those two and see the ads that I want to see from the brands that I trust, without enabling third parties able to execute on that, but without enabling rampant third-party tracking, right? So it's all done based on my terms as a consumer and the terms of the data owners, the publishers and the advertisers that I have shown trust towards. Again, this is not with a universal identifier. This is supporting the identity innovation that is already in place across a broad set of great companies, actually, who are working, some of which are already doing this today. But we want to make sure that this is done in the right way so that it has long-term feasibility. So with an endeavor as ambitious as this, we need global stakeholder input. We are operating at a global level. and privacy and policy is local. However, the browser OS platforms are releasing software that is across the whole world at once. So we have to think in the same way, but support local regulation as well. So for that, we rely on others for business and policy input, not only our own members, but reaching out beyond our own organization to all other trade orgs out there. And we're very fortunate to have a lot of trade orgs involved in bringing their members together around this important topic, collecting information, passing it to us, working with us, having that dialogue that is critical for the right standards to be built going forward. And that's where we come into place, is building those standards. We have 2 working groups that are member only, the addressability working group and the accountability working group. And those are critical. We can't have addressability without accountability, and we can't have accountability without addressability. So the 2 really go hand in hand. Addressability is focusing on the standards for how these this new range of addressability solutions, and then the accountability is working to build system-level accountability mechanisms so that every company can prove that we have captured the user's privacy preferences and adhered to those consumers' privacy preferences every single time. And everyone can demonstrate that. And then we have a task force where we provide updates. That is, anyone can join the task force, where we have bi-weekly updates on our progress with Project Rearc. And then, of course, you don't have to be a member of Tech Lab to get engaged. Please get engaged with the trade organization of your choice, like IAB New Zealand and the many other IABs that we work with globally. And there's other organizations that are working with us in partnership as well. And we're very fortunate to have that collaboration. The process is, we're in the phase 2 now. Q2 was really focused on a level set on the problem that we're trying to solve for and the constraints that we have to work within. And with that really serves as the requirements that we have to build towards when we look at technology alternatives. And that's what we're doing now. We are taking in proposals and looking at technical approaches and proposals from our member base and evaluating those against the phase 1 deliverables. From that, we should surface what appears to be the most feasible long-term approach. And in Q4, we endeavor, with your support and the support of so many involved, to get to that right level of technical standard that allows the innovation to flourish above it while affording putting everyone at the same level playing field, and distinguishing between the good actors and the bad actors, which is really important. So just to give you a status update, we now have participation from 37 different countries, 512 people on the task force, and nearly 200 people from over 100 companies on each of the working groups, and 20 industry trade orgs globally. Q2 was tough for us all. We got through phase 1. We had to put in a bit more work than we thought we would. So did a lot of the member companies. It was. I mean, we all know how difficult Q2 was, and we thank you for the effort and the efforts of so many that contributed their work. We have done about as good as we can get right now for these being living documents, and we have more trade organizations coming online with more groups. But we've got some of the key deliverables of outlining the publisher business model and all its dependencies on identifiers and the business impact on the removal, as well as on the buyer side as well, and the advertiser side, their whole life cycle of advertising and the key dependencies on cookies. And then we have some of the privacy, commercial, and other constraints that we have to work within, and a lot of consensus built around the critical need for accountability at the system level, at the technical level. And now we have some proposal templates that, that fed into phase 2. And we're now in phase 2 and accepting addressability and accountability proposals for discussion within the related working groups. And we're seeing a lot of those proposals now. You may have heard about one recently from the trade desk. And then we have some others, a couple others in place as well. So we're really getting a lot of great cooperation around proposals for how we move forward as an industry. And consensus is difficult across competitors and partners alike, but we really do need to work together on this. There's some additional work here to support Project Rearc. We do have a world where the privacy and our ability to be compliant is regional for multinational companies. That's tough. That means that they need to write software for every new region. And so we're looking at building a global privacy framework, which is a technical framework, not a policy framework. We leave that to the pros within the regional IAB organizations. But this allows us to streamline the technical standards and reduce the cost of compliance. Think of it in terms of an abstracted set of APIs and schemas, so that companies have to do less to be more compliant, and they can evolve much faster. We can all evolve much faster as regional policy evolves or comes to the fore. System level accountability is the same. To support both these key technology components, we formed a Privacy and Rearc Commit Group, and that comprises industry leaders that really deeply understand the cross-section of privacy and technology, and will oversee releases from all of the different working groups. I'll talk about Privacy Sandbox for just a moment, and then also a little bit about iOS 14. And this is going to be a sort of a brief summary, not focusing on those who are software engineers, but rather business people. So Privacy Sandbox is a collection of proposals, actually, that really try to sustain the open web and the economic benefits of advertising while removing any tracking capabilities. And it's an ambitious effort, but they're looking to answer the question, how do we continue to sustain this open web and publishers and accessibility of consumers to advertising supported content and services without identifiers, without cookies, without fingerprinting. So the objectives are, we're going to get rid of cookies, we're going to get rid of all cross-site tracking, we're going to reduce the signals that lead to fingerprinting so that it makes it very difficult to do any fingerprinting. And then we're going to, and what Privacy Sandbox does is we're going to try to shift the decisioning to the client instead of server side. And we're going to, instead of using addressable one-to-one segments, we're going to cluster users into abstract cohorts of groups of users that are sufficiently large to eliminate the possibility of any one person in that cohort to be identifiable, but sufficiently small to enable deep levels of targeting. And then utilizing these cohorts, which is all done client side, as the basis for a lot of the core use cases. And I'm going to go through this a little quickly, but these collections of proposals are conversion measurement, aggregated reporting. You know, look at the columns. There's some for measurement, relevance and targeting, fraud detection, and anti-fingerprinting. And I won't go through all of these. I'll go through a couple of the key targeting ones. Flock, for example, is where the browser is going to, and this is called federated learning of cohorts. And it really is the browser using machine learning techniques to place each of us into arbitrary interest segments. And since it's machine learning, it's hard to determine how we got placed into a segment. And then the browser is proposing to pass a key, a random key for those segments. So no one knows what that means, and it's only one key at a time. That key could be ABC123. So no one will really understand what that means, but it's a signal that allows advertisers to understand, that ABC 123 is working for me for some reason, so I'm going to continue to target that. So it's a pretty simple targeting technique. The more difficult and complex one is something you may have heard of called turtle dove, which stands for two unrelated requests. Let me see here, what was that? Two unrelated requests. Where's my cheat sheet here? Locally executed decision on victory. I guess that doesn't really matter, but what matters is it's a way to do retargeting and the retargeting of shoes, for example, to me, while having the events tied to putting me into a category and then showing me an ad, allowing that to happen without anyone, without the use of any identifiers. So the marketers will signal to the browser, I'd like to set up this interest list, and then I'd like to provide you with my advertisements that I'd like to send to that, and then the browser will use some science to arbitrarily send ads to that user in a way that can't be tied to the site or provide any identifier information back to the marketer. And let's see, another one. I'm gonna skip through some of these. The aggregated reporting API is same sort of thing. So marketers are providing signals to the browser. Browser stores a lot of events, aggregates it, and then passes it back to the marketers for some aggregated reporting. Same sort of concept for conversion measurement. Trust token is a really interesting way for anyone with a signal that verifies that I'm a real human to signal to the browser that we now know Jordan is a real human. The browser will wrap that up into something called a trust token, and then any other site that I go to can check with the browser and say, has there been a trust token established for this person? And it's just a signal of a real versus fraudulent user. The privacy budget and some of these others are really focused on reducing fingerprinting techniques. Fingerprinting is what happens when in every sort of request from my browser to a server or from my app to a server, there's a bunch of different information that is associated with that. Many pieces of information that are unique and can be used to roughly guess that this is the same user over multiple disparate views or sessions. And they're actively reducing those signals. So privacy budget is a way to limit the availability to any other party of some of that information. So it very much limits that information. So you have to use that. Since it's a budget, a developer has to use that very sparingly. Same with, IP addresses is one of those signals. And so this lets developers say, I'm not going to use IP address, I don't need that, and that can free up some other signals for specific use. So it really reduces a lot of the signals provided to developers, which makes them focus on what do I absolutely need. And the same with client hints for user agent strings. I'm going to move a little fast through this. Let's talk about iOS 14 and the recent developments around IDFA. This releases mid-end of September, meaning it starts to get rolled out across all the iOS 14 devices. And the announcement basically says there are additional disclosures around how apps use data that are being forced on the app ecosystem and provided to consumers. And the consumer now has to opt into any of the tracking that has been disclosed to them. And if they opt in, then the IDFA is available from that app to any downstream party. If they don't, there is no IDFA. And the IDFA is the ID for advertisers. So in other words, the consumer is now determining whether any device identifier for any addressability use case whatsoever is to be sent to downstream parties for attribution, for measurement, for anything, for retargeting, and they also announced a proprietary approach to mobile app install attribution. The app vendor has one sentence in this right window here to convince the consumer to allow tracking. And this window is not controllable by the app developer and cannot be re-summoned by the app developer. So it's 100% controlled by Apple. And our position on this, I just wanted to go over real quick, is at least they didn't kill IDFA. We thought that they were going to kill IDFA. That's what they told us a year ago. They were going to kill it, which tells us the antitrust, action in multiple regions is having an effect. And we support consumer transparency and control. We think the right approach is to ask the user. That is a much better direction for our industry than the large browser OS platforms taking a more paternalistic approach and making decisions on behalf of consumers, such as just eliminating identifiers or getting in the middle and not allowing consumer choice at all. Predictable privacy is the goal here. And predictable privacy means that if we're really going to move the needle on consumer privacy, we as consumers don't like to think too much. We want consistent controls across all of our experiences. We don't want, and if you have every device and operating system doing it differently, it's not predictable. It's hard to understand. And so open standards is the only way to accomplish that. And the alternative, if we don't all lean in and support open standards, is that we get this proprietary, paternalistic privacy. And this is a battle that is brewing for first-party dominance. And imagine, if you would, where you have multiple first parties and they're all fighting to make decisions on behalf of consumers. Imagine I'm at a publisher who's a first party. I'm using a Dell laptop running a Microsoft operating system and a Chrome browser through my local cable TV or cable internet provider, through maybe an Amazon or some other Wi-Fi network in my home, and all of them are trying to make decisions for my best interest on privacy and fighting with each other. This is what we're looking for unless we all come together and insist on open standards. And I know that, and I'll repeat this, there is a tremendous gut feel for a lot of the ad tech providers with this looming changes to IDFA, which is going to affect the business models out there, to make a quick workaround change and try to do more proprietary or opaque tracking techniques. We have to resist that, and we have to work together on baseline standards that move the needle forward. We have to work towards predictable privacy through the first parties that the consumers are already trusting or will trust, and then improve market innovation and competition around that. So again, the key takeaways is our systems today rely on cookies, device IDs, and other forms of IDs to support the addressability use cases. Those are being removed to eliminate all the widespread tracking of consumers and make it up to consumers. And so Project Rearc is a global initiative for standards to re-architect those systems with the consumer at the center, to preserve their privacy, yet still provide addressability, serve those addressability use cases that we rely on as an industry with accountability and compliance and guidelines that we need. And we have to stop with the immediate workarounds here. There's this saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And we have to go far quickly in order for this to happen, and we have to work together. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jordan, for presenting that today. There's so much to cover. And we are receiving some questions through the Q&A. as well. But I just wanted to start on one point, which really stood out, and that's that, you know, the shift to privacy-centric addressability and accountability is, you know, surely a good thing, but it also means potentially the death of the open web as we know it, at least for marketers. I'd be keen to hear from your point of view, who's in line to benefit most from these changes? Would it be consumers, marketers, or the browsers and OS platforms, and in what order?
Well, I think right now this direction for where things are going, I don't think the majority of consumers care all that much, but there's a small set that really care deeply and are very vocal on behalf of all consumers. I do believe that with the way things are going, we need transparency and choice, and we need to educate consumers, and they need a say in all of this. And we need to record that, and we need to propagate that and honor those preferences. And that is a real win for consumers. Unless we do this in a way that that benefits just a few large first parties who have a very strong logged in user base, tremendous amounts of data, a single privacy policy, and who are making some of these changes in really a commercial war. And then, you know, they prop up privacy and consumer privacy as the benefit, but if we don't do this the right way, the benefit is very much these large first parties who already unfortunately have a pretty large proportion of budgets. So if we do this with standards, we can achieve benefit for everyone through this open web, and that really goes towards benefiting consumers as well.
So I want to start with, I'll break that into two sections actually, because I wanted to start with open standards, which is, you know, a big priority of, and predictable privacy, as you've said, of projects like Rearc. However, if we look at iOS 14, for example, there are questions whether the opt-in from iOS 14 can even communicate with the transparency and consent framework, which is what we use in things like GDPR to pass through that consumer choice, yes, no. So how confident are you and Tech Lab that iOS will be able to plug into that type of open standard?
We're not very confident at this point. It doesn't appear that Apple has consulted with anyone in the industry on the policy or the privacy side. We do have open standards for this, and what we saw, as we've seen with you know, W3C standards and cookies, is a willingness to fracture open standards to go their own way for their you know, they're basically going their own way. And you know, this is something that we've seen quite a bit from Apple. I mean, they have their own power cords, they have their own peripherals and their own standards that are not interoperable with others. So we have to insist on open standards. If we all work together and we resist the urge to fuel their narrative by doing continued workarounds that jeopardize consumer privacy, if we double down on consumer privacy, match their narrative with talk in the talk, walk in the walk, we starve their narrative and make it more difficult for them to not support open standards.
And you mentioned that antitrust is having a bit of an effect. We know, in fact, about 30 minutes or so, we had the CEOs of Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Google sitting down at a congressional hearing all about antitrust in the US. So it's good to see that there's a bit more flexibility coming through, for example, not just getting rid of the IDFA. But we have a question which is really, you know, focusing on first-party data. Now, you mentioned earlier that having a logged in user is probably the best way to look at identity resolution, so being able to reach your consumers in a cookieless world. But you know, for many publishers and brands, in fact, and particularly in small markets like New Zealand versus America, having that breadth of logged in users is not just easy. It's not easy. They might have website visitors coming in at volume, but having that logged in or CRM first party data at scale is an issue. So, what would be your advice to brands and publishers who are trying to tackle that solution at the moment?
Well, what we're already seeing is a movement towards restricting of access. There are options for paying for access, of course, which generally aren't widely utilized by consumers. I think that we as consumers would rather see advertising. But the brands and publishers are actively asking for an email address, and I think what we need, and this is unfortunately this is in response to some of the actions that we've seen within the browser environment around third-party cookies, and we're likely to see more of that within the app ecosystem. So I think it's very important that as browser OS platforms continue towards down the road that they're on, that the brands and publishers really do look at ways to engage with the user on a quid pro quo that says, hey, what we're bringing to you is of value. And what we hear a lot of talk about and what we support, though it's not necessarily a technical standard, is a uniform way of communicating with audiences and educating them on, well, you can pay for this, or you can have advertising supported access to content and services. And here are the terms. Here's what you can do and where your level of control is, and what you need to get access in this way. So there could be different access levels. But particularly publishers will need to engage directly with consumers in a way that really with a quid pro quo. This is what you can expect from us. This is what we would like from you, and here's why. Now, if we could, it would make that education effort much more fruitful if it was uniform. That's difficult to do, but that would be great if for regions to come together around common messaging. I think it would go a long way.
So, if you think let's say the education improves in the way we talk to consumers about data and data collection and privacy, that could say, hey, we actually need you to log in now in return for content. Do you think consumers would be willing to trade off there, or is the expectation higher now?
I think that we can train users. I think that if everyone moves sort of forward, and I think that this is already happening. We're going to see user behavior gradually change, where they realize that that's now a requirement. And I think that the trick is to provide them with some uniformity of, okay, what are my preferences that I can attach to that email or that login, and that's going to be pretty key as well.
Okay, let's shift now to the brand's point of view and agencies. We know that with third-party cookies degrading, that buyers, will potentially need to pay more for regular access to an addressable audience or a verified audience. Do you think that brands and marketers will be prepared to do that, or will this just place more spend into traditional channels like TV or the walled gardens? Is there any indication you're getting on that from what Tech Lab is observing?
Well, what I'm most excited about within this, not only the trust tokens piece, but maybe a single sign-on or authenticated user, is that what you start to get is an elimination of a bit of fraud that we know exists and we try to stamp out. And I think that if, what I'm hopeful is that, as we've always seen, brands will spend what they need to do as long as they have that return on ad spend, and they'll pay. That's the beauty about digital. You can demonstrate the cost per acquisition versus lifetime value, and you have real numbers that you can support, and that requires some addressability. So, and it's not so much about the cost per acquisition, as long as it pencils out into a return for them, and they can demonstrate that, they'll pay whatever they need to. And we hope that this will it will bring more valuable media to the surface very quickly, and eliminate some of the media where the users and the experiences aren't as valuable. And we think that's a good thing.
Thanks, Jordan. We have a question around standardization, particularly of audiences and taxonomies. How is that progressing with projects like Data Label? We know that is geared at making sure information about audiences is transparent, easy to understand, and working towards standardization. What's the latest with that?
Well, I'll brief you on that. It's really today when buyers pick an audience segment. We'll go with the standby in-market auto buyer. That can be defined very different. You can buy 10 different segments labeled the same way, and they're all defined, and they're all of varying quality based on how the data seller arrived at that market segment. And they have a motivation to take as little data as possible and make it seem as large as possible, because the more they extrapolate broader audiences, the more they can reasonably sell. So there's no transparency to how each of the data segments, the audience segments, were created. So with this data label, this nutrition label, it's very important because it provides, I want to say 17 different parameters for how that audience segment was constructed. And those parameters can be fed into that return on ad spend analysis, so that you can look at, forget about it's not only a standardized audience taxonomy, which is great, but the details for how each of those segments were created. And so buyers can then really focus on the parameters that are driving the best audience segments for them, and spend more on the segments that are really driving a lot of the value. That is, everyone agrees that is excellent. We're getting a lot of great, we exist as a compliance program. So there's a lot of companies right now, ton of companies who are embracing this spec and looking at their engineering cycles to build this in. We need marketers to really push on this. It really benefits them. It also benefits leading publishers who have high quality audiences, and really benefit by distinguishing those high quality audiences from some sources of audiences that don't have the same level of quality. So with all those pushing on that, we're seeing a lot of companies embrace that now, and we're getting a lot of good traction on this year. We need more. We need everyone to go in at once. And I tell you, some of the economic and social and health unrest in the world today isn't helping a lot of us. Everyone's focused on immediate revenue right now, and we can understand that. Yeah,
we get it. It's hard right now, but I think one point which I'd like to finish up on, which you said a couple of times, was if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. How confident is yourself and Tech Lab that a collaborative global effort like Project Rearc can enable an industry solution in time? Probably not in time for iOS in September, but definitely for Chrome's changes in 2022. How confident are you?
I am more confident than I've ever been, right. And I've been pretty confident in the past. And I'll tell you some of the signals that I'm getting, and I think you're right. There isn't time before September, October timeframe that's going to be challenging. I'll tell you right now. This is an enormous effort to build consensus and alignment across companies, that everyone has their commercial interests and a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to innovate and advance and grow. And that's a challenge for us all. How do we move everybody forward in a way that still allows that to go forward? But we are seeing levels of cooperation that are unprecedented, and that is what's giving me confidence here. Particularly in the identity space, the companies that have not been working together in the past are working together now, recognizing that we do need to work together to go far here. So when you have companies that we have been really struggling to get to work together, and they've been going it alone, now working together, including big companies, public and private companies, coming to us and saying, okay, we're ready to work with you and with our competitors now, that gives me hope.
It's great to hear. Good signs. And we know this is a movable feast, changing by the day. So I'm sure we'll need another update in a few months from you.
That's for sure.
I think we're just about out of time now, so we might just wrap up. But I wanted to remind everyone that a replay of today's presentation is going to be available shortly on iab.org.nz, as well as the deck. You can also find out more information on Data Label as well at datalabel.org, and of course read an explainer of the Privacy Sandbox as well at iabtechlab.com. But just like to thank Jordan Mitchell once again for dedicating your time and sharing your knowledge here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for joining today. So take care. Bye.
Cheers.